Thank you. Hello. I'm delighted to be at the meeting of the Anthrozoological Society. In fact, as soon as I saw this name, I knew I had to do it. You've been quietly doing the same stuff as me for a very long time, and I think that both of us should congratulate each other, so to speak. Well, what is it to be an anthrozoon? Anthrozoans, or anthrozoa, are presumably humans who are also animals. Since no human has ever been anything but an animal, it's a bit odd that we find it so hard these days to get our heads around this concept. Yet imagination still can't seem to deal with it very well. People still keep asking very seriously, what is it that divides us from the animals? I once wrote a book. It's actually called Beast and Man, but people always think it's called Man and Beast, on that very subject, hoping to show that it's a rather silly question. But it hasn't, I gather, made a lot of difference. Quite lately, Timothy Leduc told me how often he still has to deal with the question, what is it that makes us unique? It seems Timothy usually says, as I do myself, yes, we are indeed, in many ways, fairly unique, but there's a lot of uniqueness about. Elephants, too, are rather unique, aren't they? And so are termites, and so are porcupines. In fact, everybody around here is pretty unique, so why would we be any different? Comes the reply, but we are far more unique than all the others. In fact, we are uniquely unique. Being a philosopher, I have to ask, what does that mean? And I think what it means is that there's a metaphysical difference, a difference of the kind of entity that you are, like the difference between just being a number and being a table, or something of that sort. We're a different kind of entity. The thought is surely that, as Descartes says, we are the only real subjects. Everybody else is just an object. But you see, there isn't today any metaphysical system around that gives room for this kind of talk, as there was in Descartes' time. So I think that's why the question keeps people so puzzled. Are you really hearing me all right? Will people put a hand up if they don't? They're not hearing me terribly well. Is the expert on this gadget move? Should I just talk a bit louder? I can. You think it's okay? Well, at this point, it seems worthwhile to think a bit harder about what this great conviction of difference means to people. Part of it, I'm inclined to think, is simple species loyalty, the spontaneous affection that we feel for familiar beings around us and the partiality that goes with it. Now, that is, of course, a perfectly respectable feeling. And in fact, other species probably have it. Sheep, similarly, probably tend to think more highly of sheep than of pigs or cows. And elephants may not have a very high opinion of hippos. And we're all inclined to think that our fellow countrymen are better than foreigners. This is natural, and it's quite in order, provided that it doesn't mean our being nasty to foreigners. But when this partiality is backed by stories, stories that claim to prove how much better we are than the groups around us, then there is real trouble. And the unlucky thing is that in our society, two stories of this kind have been enormously influential. Though the worldviews that they express differ in every other way, these accounts agree completely on this one point of human dominion. The better known of those theories is, of course, the Christian one, that we are here as God's viceroys, put here by him to rule other creatures, using all earthly things for our own purposes under him till he finally takes us to join him in heaven. At that point, the earth is supposed to vanish because it hadn't any value in itself. During the last 2 centuries, this account of things has, of course, lost credibility. People don't think it's right now, as they've drifted away from Christianity. And they've turned instead to a belief in evolution. And that change mightn't it have been expected to shake their confidence in human superiority. In fact, Charles Darwin himself quite rejected that hierarchical picture, considering that all the various evolving creatures ought to share the earth on equal terms. But as things turned out, the story about evolution that caught on was not Darwin's, but Herbert Spencer's, which the temper of the times found much more digestible. Herbert Spencer, of course, was not a biologist at all, but a political philosopher who got excited about Darwin's ideas without fully understanding them, so his view hasn't any particular scientific backing. The story is a strictly competitive one. It shows evolution as a zero-sum game, competition determined by the survival of the fittest, a contest to be won by a single enterprising species, a bit like the Olympics, but there's only a gold. And since we humans have drifted into taking charge of so many earthly concerns, we're assumed to be that worthy candidate. In fact, it emerges that our intelligence working through modern science, has effectively given us complete power and authority over the earth and the right to use it as we please. As Julian Huxley put it in the 30s, scientific man has become the growing point of evolution, the guiding authority figure who's now in charge of the whole process. And as Stephen Hawking has lately assured us, this person will eventually colonize the stars as well. In this way, you see, our status has actually become much grander under the supposed rule of science than it was under God. God, after all, used to be our superior. He might easily have had ideas of his own. And there are hints in the Bible that he might actually love and value other earthly creatures as well as ourselves. In the book of Genesis, he looks at all his creatures on the day that he's finished making them, and he sees that they are all good. At the end of the week, too, he looks at the whole thing and thinks it is very good. So, you see, not just man. In the book of Job, too, he points out that we humans know absolutely nothing about most of the wonders of his creation. When this divine critic is removed, there's nobody to make revealing remarks like this about us. No higher power that can put us in our place. We are free to exalt ourselves as we please. So today's humanistic imagery, which is still rather oddly described as modern, has thus become not just anthropocentric, but more or less anthropolatrous, self-worshipping, shows us as potentially omnipotent. It's rather interesting to notice how this unique and powerful being has lately begun to find that he's suffering from a painful loneliness, a solitude, which, as Henry V pointed out, often does afflict absolute rulers. Oh, hard condition, twin-born with greatness. Just so, Homo sapiens cries out now in his distress, are we alone? You see, we're not. And he sends inquiries into the most distant galaxies in the hope of finding someone to chat to. So far, without any result. It's no comfort to him, apparently, that he's surrounded by a crowd of relatives whom he doesn't bother to talk to, some of whom are quite communicative and might well be easier to understand than the inhabitants of Alpha Centauri. Seems he knows in advance, as one tends to, that his relations haven't anything of interest to tell him. And his devout humanism makes it very difficult for him to see them at all. Now, I'm using the word humanism here, but really we need to ask what it means. It's a word that has always bothered me. I don't use it very much, because I don't know whether it's meant to mean a new and better form of religion or just a radical cure for religion, a way to get rid of it, as on Christopher Hitchens' principle that religion is poison. Well, plenty of people, of course, today do agree with Hitchens about that. But it so happens that Auguste Comte, the founder of modern humanism, was not one of them. He called humanism the religion of humanity. And he devised ritual forms for it that were quite close to traditional Christian ones. Kant thought, and many people agree with him, that the trouble about religion was simply that it had a supernatural object, God, who wasn't real. Apart from this, Kant thought religious values and habits are laudable, were laudable, indeed essential. And he certainly had no wish to get rid of the habit of worship, only to give it a more suitable object. So Kant said, surely the worship of human beings, who are real natural creatures, could easily replace the existing idle and artificial practices. So he ruled that, for instance, the enlightened citizen would start each day by worshipping first his mother, then his wife, then his daughter, before, of course, making sure that they all did exactly what they were told for the rest of the day. And the other occasions of life could be similarly hallowed. But somehow those precepts didn't catch on. Kant's new Christian-like institutions withered like transplanted vines, even though he carefully policed them and trained his priesthood in the newly discovered skills of sociology. And a lot of people in mid-Victorian times were trying to follow Kant. This was a serious movement. I once saw the still extant Kantian temple of humanity in Paris. A well-built little Victorian church, has round arches, not Gothic ones, of course. Its walls are lined with statues of the saints of humanity. Plato, Newton, Shakespeare, Beethoven, the lot. I asked its gloomy concierge whether she thought anybody ever worshipped here. Nobody, she thinked, never. Jamais personne. Yeah. So plainly, Kant's simple recipe for grafting a new object onto traditional institutions, a new head onto an old body, didn't produce the improved life form that he had hoped for. Since his time, of course, much more effort has been put into rethinking the possibilities, yet things are still very confused. Kant's palace doesn't yet seem to have been built, nor is it clear even what should be the site for it. One person with very interesting views about this was Julian Huxley, great biologist, who reworked humanism for our times in the 1930s. Like Kant, Huxley wanted to retain the concept of worship. He writes, and this is quite interesting, the most fundamental need of man has always been to discover something, some force or tendency which was moulding the destinies of the world, something not himself, greater than himself, that's like Matthew Arnold, with which he yet felt he could harmonize his nature. The proper object of this worship is, Huxley says, not exactly the human race, but the evolutionary process that has produced it, and beyond that process, the evolving cosmos itself. This begins to sound a bit like Spinoza. Huxley retained the name God for this vast thing, effectively equating God with nature. And I'll quote a bit from Huxley. It's a simple fact that the conception which man has of the universe and its relation to himself exercises important effects upon his life. A name, therefore, is needed for this anthropological phenomenon. God is the usual name applied, and as we shall retain it in default of another, premising that we apply it here in a peculiar and perhaps novel sense. God, in this sense, is the universe, not as such, but as grasped as a whole by a mind. I don't think that's terribly clear, but it's plain what he's trying to do. Within this divine universe, however, he sees the human race as having a quite peculiar role at the forefront of evolution. This, I think, is the important and fishy thing. Huxley, in fact, goes to much trouble to explain what today's theorists usually just take for granted, the reason why he thinks humanity should be considered specially valuable and important, and why science plays such a large role in this. The reason is, he says, that the mental qualities Homo sapiens is developing through emergent evolution, especially his capacities for intelligent worship of the universe through science, are now the growing point of the whole cosmic process. That is, the kind of thinking that we do is, as it were, the top of evolution, the kind of engine driving the rest of the train. They determine which way the whole concern shall go. So if one talks of a train, that's not quite right. It might go anywhere. Well, in the 1930s, this was evidently stirring stuff. How much of it is still with us today? Clearly, what does remain, and indeed is now a dominant theme, is the concentration on human evolution. People who want to explain anything in human life today scientifically now regularly do it by speculating about the very early evolution of the species. They're not discouraged from doing this either by the lack of data about these distant events or by the thought that other kinds of explanation might be more relevant. We've also kept Huxley's glorification of the physical sciences above all other human achievements, though without the reasoning that Huxley used to support this. The thing that's most obviously vanished is the element of worship, which he saw as being central to that science and to the outward-looking impulse that created it. I am coming towards the thought that this is all a pretty bad idea, the way it's worked out today. Perhaps that's obvious. Huxley's remarks about the universal religious tendencies of humanity are clearly sound anthropology. It does indeed go on everywhere. And they've been echoed lately from several quarters. But today's humanistic theorists still seem sure that this doesn't apply to them. This may be a universal human tendency, but academics don't share it. They usually see worship as just an eccentricity of other cultures and other times, not something that we ought to take seriously now. They do indeed treat evolution very much like a god, in that they believe it created us and rely firmly on it still to maintain us. But this does not seem to involve any Spinozan reverence for it, still less any duties towards it, or towards the rest of the evolving world. There's no emphasis on our kinship with all the other creatures or our dependence on them, and certainly no suggestion that in directing the future course of evolution, we ought to pay attention to their interests. The gold medal that our species is held to have won by its evolutionary success apparently comes at no cost to us. We don't have to do anything to earn it. It serves simply to encourage us to go on just as before. That confidence in our secure standing may indeed, I think, play quite a large part, causing the extraordinary contemporary denial of climate change. Spine-chilling news about things like global warming has been reaching us for more than half a century, but it still very seldom stirs anybody to act. This news clashes too badly with our self-concept, with this very grand self-concept, that it can't be heard. Accordingly, predictions of planetary disaster clearly don't interest most of us half as much as economic dangers, or indeed as the football results. And diverting resources to deal with them has become fearfully hard. What all this shows, I think, is the amazing power of a well-accepted story, a myth, an ideology, an imaginative vision, can make empirical facts invisible even to people who claim to be the most devout realists. The evolutionary escalator that is now believed to support us has become so fixed in our imaginative landscape that we can't hear even the most impressive evidence that it might fail us. This devout faith in the myth is surely what led Julian Huxley, who'd started with a wide, inclusive Spinozan reverence for the whole cosmos, to narrow his reliance down sharply to human evolution, center his evolution on our scientific activity. The fact that we now do physics on the scale we do seems to him the most wonderful thing. Anyway. The difference from Spinoza here is striking. Having mentioned him, I want to rub it in. Spinoza did, of course, equate God with nature. and say that the highest human activity was quite simply the intellectual love of this comprehensive God. But he meant by this a kind of reverent contemplation of nature that was extremely comprehensive, a profound devotion to the whole. Flowing equally from mind and heart and influencing our lives profoundly. Of course, this kind of Spinozan pantheism has its own difficulties, but there's no doubt about its seriousness or the mountainous scale on which it's meant to work in changing our lives. By contrast, when Kant and Julian Huxley tried to redirect this same attitude towards a much smaller object, the human race, that what they produced surely turned out to be not a mountain, but a mouse, perhaps indeed a dead mouse, since the project of setting up worship hasn't worked. Huxley's preaching has no more produced eager and devout congregations than Kant's did. There's a magazine called New Humanist, which I wrote an article for, and they go on sending in, and it's nice and it's very touching, and they go in for a lot of good causes, but I cannot penetrate that they've got an answer to this kind of difficulty. It's interesting to wonder why Huxley decided to keep the word God for his authority figure. In conclusion, I think he hoped that by doing this, he could enlarge the concept of God by applying it to something universal rather than a mere personal deity. That seemed too narrow. But the awe, the wonder, the reverence, and perhaps all the personal gratitude, which have always been the roots of religion, can't possibly be redirected to an abstraction like evolution, much less to something exceptional, something as far from universal as the human race. The question why that species should have a different metaphysical standing to others is a real one, and it surely here begins to become pressing. If we now ask again, as I mentioned at the outset, what is it that divides us from the animals, we may perhaps feel inclined to answer, as Charles Darwin probably would, that this stark division owes much of its force to bad ideology and that it wouldn't hurt us to rethink it from scratch. Thank you.